Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. This is the next webinar in the Productivity and Profitability webinar series that's being brought to you by Meat and Livestock Australia and Agrista. This series is designed to assist sheep, cattle, and goat producers to increase the productivity and profitability of their businesses. We will be providing you with timely technical information that's relevant to producers across Australia. My name is Tanisha Shields and I am a consultant with Agrista and I will be your host for tonight's webinar. Tonight, we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Penny Schultz, a livestock technical specialist with the University of Adelaide. Penny and I will be discussing how to incorporate genetics into a value chain approach. Before we get to dive into tonight's topic and I hand over to Penny, we'll just cover off on a few housekeeping topics. So tonight's webinar is being recorded. You will receive a copy of the recording following this webinar, and it will also be available on the Agrista and LA websites. Throughout tonight's webinar, we'll be using Slido as the question asking platform. So if you have any questions of Penny throughout the webinar, please head to slido.com, hashtag September 2023 or SEP 2023, or scan the QR code on the screen to ask any questions that you have. I will now hand over to Dr. Penny Schultz. Penny, it's great to have you join us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the intro, Tanisha. So I'll just share my screen now.
Excellent.
Which is very similar to your screen as well. So I'll just introduce myself, Tanisha, and get things rolling.
Perfect. Thank you, Penny.
Excellent. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar tonight, or whenever you happen to be listening or watching it. As Tanisha mentioned, my name's Penny Schultz. I work for University of Adelaide as a livestock technical specialist in the field of adoption with farmers, and I work under the Drought Hub banner, or the South Australian Drought Hub. I guess my background is extension and adoption, but my key pet areas are in livestock genetics, which is what brings me here tonight, ag tech, farm business management, and sustainable farming systems. But when I'm not doing that role, my husband and I run a sheep and beef operation in the Limestone Coast region of South Australia. We're in the upper southeast, of the drier part of the Limestone Coast. And aside from that, I sit on a few boards and advisory groups as well. So as a bit of overview for the webinar today, we're focused on where genetic fits in a value chain approach in the red meat industry and whether you're in it as a producer. We'll look at what drives profit in your business. And just as a spoiler alert, I'm going to add genetics into that. We'll talk about hitting your market specs, particularly your sweet spot, and what it costs you when you don't comply with your market specs. We're going to talk about your breeding objective and what traits help to drive profit and are connected to your target market, and then how you know if things aren't working and you're not complying with your target market, and some resources and tools that can help along the way. And for those that didn't catch the QR code just before when Tanisha popped it up, if you've got questions throughout tonight, you'll notice that you won't be able to write in the chat box. Please use Slido, either go to the website or use that QR code. So as a bit of an introduction, producers are a key part of the red meat value chain, even if you don't feel like it, particularly maybe right now. Not meeting market specs seriously hurts your profitability. And your market specs is one of the key ways that you are part of that value chain. And not hitting that sweet spot in your market specifications is sometimes an even bigger deal when we're in a lower market price place, like now. And the specs can often be tighter and discounts are bigger in value in this time as well. And so it's seriously costly. And most genetic traits influence specs, and your selection and breeding programs can influence your ability to consistently and efficiently hit that sweet spot. So we want to be able to use all the data and feedback and tools we have to assess our product performance and make improvements to our breeding program and management too, if needed. So what is a value chain approach? Because it's a term that gets used and bandied around a lot. And again, reiterate, you are part of it. We used to always use the term supply chain. To me, that's producing a bulk commodity and throwing it out there. A value chain is where we produce a high quality product, a premium product, and value is extracted along the way and takes into consideration all the activities that go into making a product that consumers eat or use. So that includes processors and retailers, consumers, but also us as producers, backgrounders, and feedlotters. And as I mentioned before, your strongest link to this chain is you're hitting your target market, but might also include having a good relationship with your buyer and processor, understanding what your consumers want, knowing things about future trends or concerns and opportunities. And we know we can't all be out there selling steaks and sausages at our local farmers market and talking to people that buy it, but we can care about what we produce and understand our customer. So I'm not an ag economist, and Agrista has those on their books. So I'll just put that out there right now. But even for genetics, we can't forget what drives profit in our business, and it needs to be connected. So profit is a factor of our income, which is the quantity of the product that we produce, and then the price that we receive for it. And then also our costs, which is both operating costs and fixed costs. We generally focus on those variable operating costs because they're the ones that are directly related to our enterprise and go up and down quite a lot. And we know that the best opportunity we have for improving profitability is being more productive. So that's producing more product and keeping our costs down. So our lower cost of production. And that often involves growing and utilising more feed and matching our feed supply with demand. So we do also know that those top benchmarking producers, they do well in optimising their systems, but we also know that many of them are quite consistent at producing a better product and often have a higher price received. So this is not about chasing that top price in the marketplace. I don't recommend that. Doing that often means that you are, having production systems out of season and have higher costs of production. But it is about hitting your market specs consistently so you can maximise the price that you've received. And also include evaluating market opportunities where your product might fit, which might also include assurance programs, MSA grading, grass-fed accreditations, environmental stewardship programs, and the list goes on. So I thought we could focus on 5 factors, I guess, if we're wanting to drive more profit. We can optimise our stocking rate. We know that the top producers have higher stocking rates. We can improve our weaning rate, which is the result of higher lambing or mortality. We can improve growth rate, which is both animal performance and genetics, and our pasture quantity and quality. We can control our costs, and we know that top producers do a great job of that, but we can also evaluate our market opportunities and our market specs. So what of these fast 5 actually have a genetic component to them? Now, stocking rate, I'll put a question mark next to. Me, as somebody who loves genetics, will always link it somehow, but I'll put a question mark in it because it's not clear. Our reproductive performance definitely has a genetic component to it, and a number of them. Growth rate definitely has a genetic component and a pretty strong one. Cost of production, there's a number of factors there that have genetic influences, and meeting our market specifications, which I'll talk about tonight, definitely has genetic influence. So are you actually hitting your target market? Do you know? Do you know how well you're doing it? Do you know what it's costing you when you don't? And if you're not consistently in your target market, what levers do you have to pull? So I've chucked up there management and genetics. And the traits that need to be improved will differ in their influence of management or genetics, but generally both will have an effect. But I'm going to focus on genetics for this session. But before I keep going with that, if you are struggling to hit your target market and your cost of production is going through the roof, trying to get there, maybe you don't have the right target market. So just to throw that out there, that you need to ensure that you don't have the wrong target market, and that's what's causing you the issues. So a study that was published in 2017 looked at non-compliance to market specs in a significant Victorian value chain, a beef value chain this is. This included 63,000 head of cattle, and it was over 2 years, 2012 and 2013. So they were processed, evaluated, graded, and they looked at how well they complied to their market specs. Although the compliance varied greatly from year to year, no surprises there, and varied between heifers and steers, not surprising there. Out of the whole data set for those 2 years, only 33.9% met specifications for weight and fat. As a weighted average across all those carcasses, $78 per carcass was the cost of non-compliance. And that went all the way up to $344 per carcass. And I actually went and had a look at those in that box, and they were just way too heavy and way too fat. This was also based on $3.30 for carcass weight. So you do the math, what that would be worth for you if you $78 was for $3.30, whatever you're getting, that's your multiplication factor. Now, I'm guessing you're thinking, surely in the last 10 years, we're doing a better job of meeting our market specs. Spoken to a couple of processors because this is the most recent published data, and we're not doing much better. But there's, let's not despair. The sweet spot for that data set, you can see the blue lines there. That's the sweet spot, but sort of within those blue lines, that's our fat and carcass weight specifications. And obviously each cross represents steers or heifers in that consignment. So this was also a time when MSA was only just getting popular. A lot of cattle are now MSA graded. Good news is for MSA graded cattle in Australia right now, our compliance rates for MSA grading is really high. So we're looking at over 90%. So we're on the right track for eating quality, maybe not for carcass weight and fat. And I'm sure as a producer, you want to be rewarded for what you supply. And you also want a reputation of being a reliable supplier of animals that consistently hit specs, even more so now that things are pretty tight and tough. So I've pulled out a land grid, and I have taken off the company names. And this is a recent one, so this one from a few weeks ago. We're looking at the market specs here. So we've got 20.1 to 32 kilos carcass weight, fat score 2 to 3, and our sweet spot there is $4.70. But beware the discounting, because if we go too heavy, we lose 50 cents, which is a big deal at the moment. If we go under and have 16 to 20 kilos, we're looking at $3 a kilo. For some people right now, that may not cover cost of production. So be careful of that. But then if you're under 16 kilos, heaven forbid, we're looking at $1 a kilo. We do not want to be there. And also if they're too lean, we'll lose $1 a kilo as well. And remember how I mentioned that right at the start, that hitting that sweet spot in poorer price years is actually more important than in good years, because the discounts might be a little bit different. I went back a couple of years to find a grid from, I think it was July 2022. And here's our specs here. So you can notice the specs are wider. So we've got 16 to 32 kilos. and $7.60. That sounds fantastic right now. Sorry, we're not getting that. But then relatively low discounting as well. So we've got a wider specification and less discounting if we don't hit that spec. And in fact, even for under 16 kilograms, we're still getting $5 a kilo at 2 years ago. And even if they're quite lean, we only lost 30 cents. So that's why right now it's even more important to hit your market specs. So from a beef example, things get a little bit more complicated, a lot more information there than in comparison to the lamb job. But let's break it down. So we're looking at our ideal target market here. So market specs, we're looking at 240 to 420 kilos, fat depth of 5 to 22, 0 to 4 teeth, that's our dentition, and meat and fat color, we're looking at 4 or under. But our sweet spot actually sits much tighter. So we're looking at 300 to 420 kilograms, and it even goes on to describe boning groups. So that essentially means that the whole carcass grades better, MSA standards grading. Now, in a nutshell, we're looking at an animal that meets a decent carcass weight spec at a relatively young age, but it marbles well, MSA grades really well in general across the carcass. It's not quite a unicorn, but I guess a balanced effort of management, environment, and genetics. So make sure you understand your market specifications, including the discounting systems. And if you're not sure about anything, contact your processor or buyer well before you send your consignment. And always check your feedback when it comes back to know how well you did. So if I was in a room of people, I'd be asking them, do you have a breeding objective and is it written down? For those that have done a Bred Well, Fed Well workshop before, perhaps particularly one of the older ones, you might actually recognise these points. Your breeding objective needs to be fit for your farm. So that relates to your farming environment and your production system. And these can be quite unique to your farm. And fit for your market. So this relates to your specific target market for lamb or beef, which is generally focused on carcass and growth traits. So looking at muscling, which could be different letters depending whether it's lamb or beef, fat, IMF, which is marbling, lean meat yield or retail beef yield. And then for growth traits for both lamb and beef, we're looking at weights at different times in the production system, which are weaning, post-weaning, yearling, and beyond as well. So key message is genetics is responsible for a significant proportion of the gains that we do make in productivity and profitability on farm. So you need to make sure that you spend a good amount of time in this space. Sometimes we just check around ram buying time, and what we're doing in our ram catalogues doesn't reflect what we might be selecting for when we're keeping and culling ewes. So they need to be brought in together. And genetics is also permanent and cumulative. So a sound genetic investment will pay dividends in the long term, but poorer decisions will also hang around for longer than what you hope as well. So from a beef breeding value perspective, in the beef sector, estimated breeding values or EBVs are what we look at, and the growth traits are expressed as weight traits. So the weight EBVs that we have are 200-day, 400-day, and 600-day weights. So we're looking at weight because weight is a strong determinant of the price received for the animal and also influences the quantity of product that we produce. So this is a key economic or profit driver. The time, so the 200, 400, 600 should relate to when your target market age is appropriate or your production system. A really common breeding value that people focus on is 400 days, so yearling. So often people are selling around that time, either as a feeder or as even a finished lighter weight product as well. So I'm going to use that as an example of how we might look at weight EBVs. So I've used Angus for no particular reason, just it's a really common breed in Australia, so that's what I've gone to. The breed average for Angus 400-day weight is plus 90. Your herd average for 400-day weight, often you won't know that. And you might not be a stud breeder. So let's say that your herd might be a bit below average. So plus 80 there. But then you go and buy a bull that's plus 100 for that trait for 400 days. So if you're selling yearling calves, the difference between the bull purchased and your herd is actually plus 20. So your calves should be around about 10 kilograms heavier. So at $3 a kilo live weight, and that's conservative, I hope, is $30 a head. So we're hoping that that bull goes on to sire 100 or more calves. So we're talking thousands of dollars just based on one trait that's in your back pocket. So there's actually a range of carcass breeding values in the beef breed plan system. We've got carcass weight, eye muscle area, rib fat, rump fat, retail beef yield, and intramuscular fat. So eye muscle area, and it's expressed a little bit differently in the lamb job, is EMA, and it's the centimetres squared. So that's the eye muscle area, that 12th to 13th rib site. You often see a carcass picture that's sort of sliced part way down. And generally more positive is more favourable. And it does influence carcass weight and retail beef yield quite strongly. And then our carcass weight breeding value is based on our hot standard carcass weight, which is defined like a standard carcass. The AusMeat system, 650 days, 750 days per Angus. Don't get hung up on the breed differences, but carcass weight is definitely a profit driver. Rib fat and rump fat. Yes, there are two. Rib fat is the depth of fat measured at that 12th to 13th rib site. So that's, if you're looking at a nice ribeye steak, that's, so long as it hasn't been trimmed before you saw it, that's the rib fatness. And then rump fat is measured at the P8 rump site, which is just on the top of the rump, more on the top of the animal. So again, more positive is generally more favourable, but more negative can also be favourable depending on your breeding objective. So we need a balanced approach to fat. Fat is positively correlated to reproductive performance, particularly, and resilience, I guess we'd call it, particularly in tough times. So we need a balance here. But it's negatively correlated with yield, so lean meat yield. But we do need a minimum amount of fat for quality and processing purposes in our carcasses. So retail beef yield, I mentioned that a couple of times already. So this is the difference between our carcasses in that, I suppose, a boned out, once you pull all the retail cuts out of a carcass, and the more positive, the more favourable, because we've got more saleable meat. It's a funny-ish kind of trade. It's almost like an index in itself. So it's estimated almost exclusively from correlations with live weight, live animal scanned eye muscle area, and fat depths, because obviously for breeder cattle, particularly stud cattle, we're not killing and eating all the bull carcasses at a young age, because we want them to go on as breeders. But there is a system where you can put progeny tests through the program to get actual retail beef yields as well. And then intramuscular fat we know as marbling. It's also measured at the sort of steak at that 12th, 13th rib site. And the more positive, the more favourable. But sometimes chasing marbling can have an impact on other traits, such as retail beef yield. So make sure all the traits that are important to you your breeding objective, are in your breeding objective and going in the right direction. But I'm hearing a murmur in webinar world, even though I can't really hear you, that I don't think I'm actually getting paid for these traits. And this might actually be true. But if your target market includes MSA grading, then IMF is definitely important to you. And you might already be on the right pathway for retail biofuel if you're also chasing growth in eye muscle area and maybe have a balanced approach to fat. And if you're not currently getting paid on these traits, particularly maybe if you're in a feedlotter type operation where you're selling to a feedlot, don't ever assume that you're not being measured, having data collected, and even being ranked as a supplier based on traits like this, including growth and weight gains, or weight for age gains. If you're currently sending steers and heifers to a feedlot and you're not getting information that can help you with your breeding and management, please ask nicely for it. Many do provide it now, and I think it's valuable even for the feedlotters to be giving good feedback to their suppliers, so there can be good relationship and gives you the opportunity to produce what they need. And we're now seeing some value-based payment systems coming into the industry. So we're working towards more accurate and objective ways to pay producers for the quality and quantity of product they produce. Moving on to lamb. So rather than breed plan, the system's called sheep genetics. There's some similarities in the trends and in the traits. We've got eye muscle depth rather than eye muscle area. And that's measured in a slightly different way. Both management and nutrition, granted, are influence expression of eye muscle, but EMD as a breeding value tells you that genetic potential of that animal for increased muscling. So improving muscling improves your carcass value and lean meat yield. So you've got a higher dressing percentage. It's also correlated with better reproductive performance and worm resistance. So there's your free lunch. But do watch out for not so good relationships with growth and leanness and meat quality as you go leaner. But again, if you've got all those traits that are important to you in your breeding objective, and that's how you're selecting animals, you can move all those traits in the right direction. It just might be a little trickier. We've got fat breeding values. So rather than rib fat and rump fat, we've just got fat, but it is provided at different ages as well. So we've got weaning, yearling, and hogget measurements for fat. A little bit the same as cattle, but probably a little bit more finicky in the sheep job. Fatness, particularly for prime lambs, has what I'm calling an intermediate optimum. So it's a bit like Goldilocks and her porridge. She doesn't want it, can't be too fat and it can't be too lean, because it is possible for carcasses to be both. One can be too fat, one can be too lean. So you need to know what your market requires. But for breeding use, fat helps you to maintain weight and fat, or condition, I should say, in tough times. Those resilience traits don't show up so much when times are good, but certainly during tougher years. And we also know that genetic fat in animals is correlated with improved reproductive rate, also coefficient of variation of fibre diameter. It's also positive with marbling and eating quality. But as your carcass fat goes up, your fleece weight goes down, interestingly. Weight for age. So I'm keep using the terminology weight or growth for age, because it's not just about what weight they reach, it's how quickly they get there. So again, we've got multiple times that weight is recorded and expressed as a breeding value. We've got weaning weight, post-weaning weight, yearling weight, hogget weight, adult weight. But you need to select for the traits that are important to you at what times. And selection for higher growth, you're trying to get lambs to market sooner or at a heavier weight for the same age. Bit like before the other traits, if you're selecting for improved growth, you actually improve your reproductive rate, you can improve your lean meat yield and higher fleece weights. But beware, it also can blow out your fibre diameter, increase your birth weights, and result in higher mature weights. And for some people, that's quite important. More recently, we've got lean meat yield and eating quality breeding values for the sheep industry. And a higher percentage of lean meat yield means there's a higher proportion of carcass lean meat yield, so more meat, less fat and bone. It's similar to retail beef yield, but a little bit different. And we've also got intramuscular fat being our eating quality trait. So more genetic potential for marbling. Again, I'm hearing that murmur, I'm not getting paid for these traits yet, so why should I worry about it? That's fair enough. But all I can say is these traits will grow in importance into the future, so keep them in mind, consider them, and they're definitely already important to the next couple of links in your value chain. However, unlike beef, they're actually trickier to measure in lab and even trickier to report back to producers. But the industry is working pretty hard to fix this. And it's no secret there is an actual processor that is paying on lean meat yield and eating quality. And there are some other processors gearing up for this. So this is of that processor. This is a recent grid, and that's their sweet spot for lean meat yield and for carcass weight. And then they pay premium for higher marbling carcasses, which is pretty exciting. Watch this space. So what else can we be considering? We've already spoken about that lean meat yield and the eating quality stuff. And the value-based payments. These are things that we can think about. If we're not currently being paid for them, should we be including them or not? But then we've also got a few new things coming at us, and one of them is sustainability and methane emissions. And there's a lot of research going into this space. So rest assured that geneticists are working on this. There is now a research index for sustainability in merinos. And down the track, we could have similar things for other breeds, beef sector. It's not an easy thing to measure and needs to consider a number of factors, but it's exciting that we're able to do this and offer this to breeders as well as people wanting to buy rams based on those sort of things that are important to their target market. We've known for a while about these welfare and well-being traits, but the signals are stronger. You know, we've already got DNA tests for polled hornness in both sheep and cattle. For sheep, we've got worm resistance, and we've also got fly strike resistance. At the moment, fly strike resistance, it's kind of correlated traits. You know, it's our breech strike and breech wrinkle that we can work towards to reduce the need for, I suppose, chemical or surgical ways of minimising fly strike. But the sheep industry is also moving towards naturally fly strike resistant sheep full stop, so not just a correlated trait. So that's exciting. Net feed intake has been around for a while, and there are some people that are focused on that as a trait. So that's really a big lot of numbers that I showed up earlier around that grass-fed beef specifications. I've just simplified it a bit and grabbed that sweet spot that we were looking at, just to draw attention to the genetic traits of influence. So on the left-hand side, we've got the attribute for the market spec, and on the right-hand side, we've got the genetic traits that influence that. So hot standard carcass weight. So we've got a carcass weight trait, but also growth affects how heavy our carcass will be. Fat, obviously we've got our couple of fat traits, rib fat, rump fat. The dentition, it's quite an odd term to use these days, but 0 to 4 teeth. Basically, we're trying to get animals to a certain weight and maturity without them being. And it's not included on that spec sheet, but I've thrown in there ossification, the little box around it. So we're talking more about growth for age, and ossification is a measure of that in the animal, and it's used in the MSA grading system. Meat colour and fat colour, I've just chucked in there MSA management guidelines because it's a trickier one to connect to genetics, or there's little genetic linkage there to those traits. However, after thinking about it, docility and temperament does affect meat colour because it can increase the incidence of dark cutting animals. If you've got stirry, stressy animals, they're more likely to cut dark, and they're also more likely to stir up everything else in the consignment and make them cut dark. Docility is a reasonably heritable trait, and you can make quite good gains. And there are a number of beef breeds now that report docility breeding values. So hindsight, should have stuck that in there. Boning groups, it's MSA grading terminology. So I've thrown in there marbling, 400 and 600 day weight, rib fat, meat and fat colour. But essentially, the lower the boning groups, the better. So we're looking at most of the cuts within the carcass meeting those really good MSA grading specifications. So MSA index was not included on that specification sheet. I've thrown it in there as a guide because there are now processes that are providing that information back to suppliers, to producers, and they're also managing and sort of grading within their graded carcasses to be able to sell to premium markets based on not just if a carcass grades or not, but how well it grades. I've thrown in there that this sort of specification is likely 60 plus points, so we're talking above average. So if you're not familiar with the MSA index, this is not a talk about Meat Standards Australia, but I can't not deliver this talk without sort of going over it because over half of Australia's slaughter cattle are now MSA graded, which is fantastic, and some states are as high as 90% graded cattle. But essentially, it's a national measure of the predicted eating quality of the whole carcass, not just the nice cuts. And it's expressed as a number between 30 and 80. I had a look, the current average for 21-22 year was 57.37. And it does go up and down a little bit depending on the year, but that's about average. And it actually looks at 39 cuts in the carcass and how well they eat or how well they're predicted to eat. So it's like a model that predicts it. And it's a weighted average across all those scores. So if you looked at a carcass and how they get their average, and that's how it works. There's some great tips and tools on the MLA website that explains this quite well. So essentially, the higher your index, the higher the beef eating quality of many cuts in that carcass compared to a lower index. Note, this is not a yield measurement, just an eating quality measurement. So because it is a model, it takes into consideration lots of factors and not just genetic ones. But to pull out what the main ones are, HGP status. Basically, if you don't HGP your cattle, you get 5 MSA index units higher. Milk-fed villas, there's not too many of those anymore, but you get 4 more units. If you don't consign cattle through a sale yard setup, you are 5 index points higher in general. And then marbling has a strong influence. That's not surprising. And hump height and tropical breed content, and the two are connected. So if you've actually got tropical breed content for about, I think it's every 10 mils of hump height, you've actually got a minus 0.7 on the index. and the more tropical breed content you have, you actually have a minus factor as well. So if you have 100% tropical breed content, it's minus 6.3. Ossification score, which I mentioned before, where it has quite a strong influence as well. So that's how well you get your cattle to their weight for age. So it's about growth and also about the journey they had to get there. So if you've got stress factors, nutritional checks, and even heifers have a slightly higher ossification score, that means that they may not eat as well. So they might reach by the same time as something else, but they've had a bit of a hard knocks in the middle, and it can have a detrimental effect. In a nutshell, if you want to improve your MSA index, there's just a few strong ways for you to influence that. One is to increase your marbling. So you've got both genetic strategies to do that by purchasing bulls with higher EBVs for IMF percentage, but also finishing on a really good plane of nutrition prior to slaughter is also a key way to enable that marbling to express itself. Also increasing carcass weight and rib fat. So we're talking about size with higher growth, breeding values. So you're achieving heavier carcasses at the same age, and obviously improving their nutritional plane as they're growing as well. Now I'm just going to skip over that. We can come back to that if somebody's got a question on ossification. So how do you actually know if you're hitting your target market? Now, this is a tricky area because not everybody gets really good feedback, but we want to get good feedback from our processor or our feedlot performance as well. So performance in the actual feedlot and then performance when our feedlot cattle are then slaughtered. You need a strong relationship with your processor and feedlotter, not just your agent. You can still use an agent, but it's good to have that direct connection with where your cattle or lambs are going. You've probably heard of Livestock Data Link before. We now have MLA's new My Feedback platform, which is coming shortly. I've got a slide on that in a minute. But you want to be able to analyse and evaluate all that feedback you receive, work out what it's costing you not hitting that sweet spot, and then make changes to your management and breeding objective if you need to. So value-based payment systems in the beef sector can be quite daunting, and they're not widespread. There's pretty much only one or two processors that are really delivering on this at the moment. But in a nutshell, it'll report back on individual animals for beef for their fat, meat colour, fat colour, ossification, MSA marble score, and eye muscle area. It'll also give you individual carcass weights, the total value for each carcass, the MSA index for each carcass, and the lean meat yield. And then it'll also give you an average dollar per head, average MSA index, and average lean meat yield across your consignment as well. Now, this is actually a carcass comp that somebody entered, and that's why it fits on the page. But you can have, if you've got 100 or 300 animals that are consigned, you're able to get this level data on them if you sell through a value-based system. Much easier to see on a graph. So essentially each of those little squares is an animal. We've got on our vertical axis is lean meat yield, horizontal axis is MSA index, and essentially, ideally, you'd like to aim for number one, so your top right-hand corner. But more generally, this is number one is the top 20% for both quality and yield. The square in the middle, number 4 is your average quality and yield, but that's for your particular consignment. But this can be expressed for the whole grid. And then obviously you don't want to be in the bottom left-hand corner if you can avoid it, or any of the red ones really. So MLA is my feedback, and yes, I have stolen this slide from a colleague from MLA, well actually the Integrity Systems company, which is managing this. It's a little bit exciting, and it's not far away from being launched. And this combines, wait for it, the NLIS system, Meat Standards Australia, Animal Health Australia, National Livestock Reporting System, and any additional information you get on disease or defects from the processor. And for those in South Australia, you get abattoir surveillance data in one single platform. So that's the ultimate for analysing production, eating quality, disease incidents, both at a sheep mob level and cattle individual level, and into the future sheep individual level as well. So there's sort of never seen before reports, great feedback, and also a link to solutions. So those animals that aren't in the right square on your graph, you'll be able to find out what you can do on farm to improve where they come in. So it'll give you some great graphs. So which ones actually meet compliance fully and which ones don't, why they don't meet your specs, and also how much it costs you. So you don't have to do it yourself. It's doing it all for you. So that's pretty cool. So my take-home messages from today is not meeting your market specs, which is your link to the value chain, can be really costly for your profit. Genetics is responsible probably for more than what you realise of the gains that you've made in productivity and profitability, and it deserves your attention. And your breeding objective traits need to be linked to profit drivers, which include those that are linked to your environment and your farm and your production system, but also to your target market. And you need to get access to that feedback information so that you know how your product performs, and then aim to improve your compliance and aim for that sweet spot where you don't get discounted and you do get rewarded. Also don't forget that management is really important. I know I'm banging on about genetics here today, but management also is linked to your place in the value chain, and good genetics will not fix bad management. So you may have noticed through some of the slides where I've put up some information, if I've got it from somewhere, I've put a link to where I got it from, or noted the resource. So if you get access to this presentation, you can go back and you can click on those things, so you can go directly to those tips and tools or things of interest to you. But also these are the links to key areas around MSA and solutions to feedback. MLA's got a great genetics hub, so you can learn Genetics 101 and beyond, as well as the new My Feedback. And if you haven't done a Fred Well Fed Well workshop yet, there's heaps being run around the country at the moment, and it's a really good starting point for your breeding objective. Thank you very much. And I just quick thank you to Elkie Hocking, Thara Preston, Wayne Pitchford and Sean Miller that have helped with a few aspects of this presentation, including a few of the photos too, and grids and market specs. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Penny. That was absolutely great. I know I've definitely taken quite a few things away about how we can start to try and match our breeding objectives to those market specs. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions for Penny, we'll go through those now. So jump onto Slido, enter the code that's on the screen, or scan your QR code. We've got a few that have come in already, Penny, so I'll get started. Okay. First one is, how do I even get started or find a target market?
Okay, so there's no beef or sheep reference in there, Tanisha?
No, sorry.
No, okay. Yeah, so if you've got a good agent, that's a good person to speak with. Look at your seasonality and your production system. So if you're starting in a beef enterprise, look at when you have your feed demand and feed supply, and try and match them as a starting point, so that you know when you might have cattle at weaning time or yearling time. But I think it has actually a fair bit to do with where you farm, not just what you farm, is what dictates your target market. Just throwing animals into the sale yard doesn't cut it anymore. And it's actually really good for your business to have a target market goal. But I think having a chat with some buyers and processors too can help you find that target market. And also where other farmers in your region might be selling to as well. But that doesn't mean you have to sell where they are, but it might be a good starting point.
Excellent. Thanks, Annie. The next one that's come through is, how do I know if I'm focusing on the right traits?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, so using your feedback certainly helps. For merino breeders, if you've got a self-replacing flock, you can also use commercial genomic flock profiling. So you can see whether your breeding objective is actually reflected in your progeny that you're breeding. But yeah, it's getting access to really good feedback, and that is tricky. It's not easy, and I've sort of been harping on about it, but that is the best way to know if your product's performing the way that you're hoping it is, and then adjusting your breeding objective if need be. But yeah, also for Angus breeders as well, there's some commercial genomic tools as well to see where your base averages is. So for example, I put that example up and I said, oh, let's just say that your breed average is plus 80 for 400-day weight. Well, there's actually some commercially ready genomic tools that can tell you exactly where your herd is sitting now.
And the best way planning to get access to that feedback right now, there is an easy way,
Mhm.
is there?
Yeah. So aside from the feedback you get from your processor, um, there's a bit of a transition point at the moment with Livestock Data Link and MLA's My Feedback, where if you're not already on Livestock Data Link, it's hard to get on. If you're already registered for Livestock Data Link, all your information is still there. And I think there's a number to call if you're unsure. But Livestock Data Link is similar to my feedback, but was the sort of version before, the last sort of 10 years worth, and puts all your carcass feedback for both sheep and cattle up against grids up online, and does provide those sort of tips and tools to do better. But because my feedback is about to come on board, you can't sort of have a new registration for Livestock Data Link. So if you think you've registered for Livestock Data Link previously, even if it was years ago, you still exist on there. You can still access that information. And if not, wait a few weeks and register for my feedback, and that'll come on board quite soon.
Very exciting times.
Yeah.
The next question we've got come through, Penny, is a little bit of a change of tact. To what extent are sustainability metrics influencing price or production approaches, and will they be included in my fee?
Um, They won't be included in my feedback at the moment, as far as I know. Generally, sustainability, there are a few sort of small assurance programs, mostly around emissions, but there are some that are much broader and take into consideration a whole sustainability framework. They're not what I call mainstream. Right now, the signals that processors are getting back from their export markets, particularly higher value and Europe, is that not just carbon and emissions, they're wanting to know more about the sustainability of our product. Just saying it's clean and green and, we're from Australia doesn't cut it anymore. We need to provide additional credentials and that stand up, like our traceability system does. And yeah, we're still not quite there yet on how we're going to prove that. But there are some quite specific systems. But even the likes of Coles have now got a like lower emissions beef product, and there's Aussie suppliers going into that. But yeah, it's sort of a watch this space. But the research index, when it becomes a fully fledged index, because it's a breeding value, you will be able to benchmark against it like you can other breeding values and see your progress over time. But yeah, as something that we can measure in my feedback, not at the moment, but I can see that we will become a time, a bit like, we've got the MSA included on that platform. We've got, animal health down the track, and we're able to measure our carbon footprint and our sustainability status. I can't see why we can't include that on my feedback.
Watch this space, as you say.
Yeah.
Another question we've had come through is, how do backgrounders get access to appropriate feedback?
Oh, I'll take that one on notice. That is trickier because you're one more step back from the processing link in the chain. I guess if you know that there's a consistent pathway, so you sell to the same people each year, those people sell to the same feedlot each year, and you've got an NLIS tag, obviously, then there may be a way to trace that back. But if you don't have that consistency of who buys and sells, yeah, it's pretty tricky. Maybe in the future, just based on our EID system, maybe we can trace it back. But because you are one more step back, it might be quite tricky. So for now, you would then just focus on the traits that you're getting paid on.
Very interesting. I think we've got time for one final question, Penny. And the question that I've got come through here is, how do I improve lean meat yield?
Well, I'm assuming it's for the lamb job.
Yes.
Yes, so we have a trait. We have a trait for lean meat yield for our breeding value. So if that's something that's important to you, you include that breeding value in your breeding objective when you're selecting rams. That is really the easiest way. As I mentioned, there are some correlated traits for lean meat yield, but it's best to select on the trait of interest and also make sure you're including the other traits of interest. So sometimes you might have, if you're chasing lean meat yield, you can get a very lean animal, full stop. And if fat is important to you because you want a bit like Goldilocks, you don't want them too fat, you don't want them too lean, then you need to keep the fat traits within your breeding objective as well. But yeah, the easiest way is include it in your breeding objective, and perhaps have a chat to your ram breeder as well. Not all are recording and presenting those breeding values.
Interesting. Thanks, Penny. I think that at the end of the day, it really is coming down to making sure that you have that clear breeding objective that's relating to your market specs.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Penny, and thank you to everyone that's joined us for tonight's webinar. I know I've certainly gained some very valuable knowledge on your insight and expertise on how we can maybe incorporate our genetics into the value chain approach. The audience here tonight, if you have any additional questions or suggestions for future webinar topics, please feel free to reach out. The best way to reach out is by completing the survey at the QR code that's on the screen, and there's also a link in your Slido. This feedback's really important as it helps us to guide what topics we have for future webinars. If you're listening to this recording, please also complete the survey. It doesn't close after the webinar tonight. So if you have any feedback from watching the recording, please also jump on and complete that survey. I'd like to thank everyone again for attending, and we look forward to you all joining us for our next webinar on the 11th of October. We'll be hearing an update from Basil Doonan of Pinion Advisory on all things spring pasture management next month. And one final exciting announcement for tonight. We have just released the first episode of our podcast series. So you can find this on Spotify under the Productivity and Profitability Media series. I'm happy listening to our podcast series. Thank you, Penny.
Thank you, Tanisha.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.